So I wanted to get a list of 10 women that have inspired me throughout history. And I sat down and I came up with about 50 names. I'm like, okay, this lecture can't be 8 hours. So I worked it down to about 25. And I worked, and finally I couldn't do it. So I tried to get some names you would all know, some names you've never heard of, leaders in politics, science, the law. I got some younger women, some older women, diversity. So I got it down to about 15, and then I just gave up. So here's my list of heroines from history that inspired me. And later, feel free to holler about who inspired you. And again, I apologize that not everybody was on the list. Well, we have to start with Martha. There's Martha Washington, of course, with her signature bonnet, looking a lot like Betty Crocker meets Mrs. Santa Claus. No question about it. So Martha was amazing. I've always complained that textbooks, first off, Martha was very, very private. She hated the publicity, very private. She once was riding in a carriage, and the town she went in, they organized on the spot a military escort, a 21-gun salute. And she writes back to a relative and says, quote unquote, "It's as if I'm a very great somebody." So she was very, very humble. We're not sure, but most historians believe she burned hundreds and hundreds of George Washington's letters. He passed on December 14, 1799. She lived until May of 1802. And a lot of letters disappeared. We think she burned them to try to recapture her privacy. So Martha was a very private woman. She hated to sit for a portrait, and that's why this is probably the most complimentary one. Most of them, she looks just flat out grumpy. But I think history has done her and George a disservice, because if we use the other paintings of Martha when she was younger, look at the posture. There's a sense of confidence. She almost has a Cheshire cat or a Mona Lisa kind of, she's in the know in the look. So there's a different Martha. For example, the earliest story we have about Martha was when she was 17. She was being courted by a very prominent man who rode up to the house on horseback and hollered out for the father, who walked out on the porch. The man doesn't dismount, he stays on the horse. Martha hears the conversation with him requesting permission. She walks out, walks up to the horse, has the man bend down and smacks him across the face, tells him to get out. She's not going to get off the horse. He can't court her. I mean, that's feisty. The other story about the young Martha was when she was 17, she married a man that was 37. So this is very bold. Moreover, her family was kind of upper middle class. The family she married into was high upper crust. And as you know from your history and civics classes, Virginia, of all the colonies, was the most class status conscious. You didn't move up and down. So the fact that a 17-year-old girl married a 37-year-old man who's the heir of Custis, the heir to the largest tobacco empire in Virginia, is quite something. Let's add to that. The man, 37, Daniel Parke Custis, he was, his father, John, in the 70s, was notoriously grumpy and difficult. He opposed his son's marriage to Martha because it was a marriage down, right? Which is what I told my late wife's father and mother, that their daughter's marrying so far down, but sometimes this happens. So he opposed her marrying down. Martha at 17, meets with a 71-year-old John Custis, this cantankerous pain in the you-know-what. She's 17, he's 71. And think about the 1700s. This dynamic just doesn't happen. We don't know what they said when they met. All we know is after the meeting, he gave his consent for marriage. So Martha must have had something on the wall. The other thing we know about Martha was every winter of the Revolutionary War. Now, the war starts in spring of 1775 and lasts until fall of 1783. This is a long war. Every single winter of the war, she visits George in his winter camp. I always liked Cokie Roberts, and she wrote a nice book about the founding mothers, but she said Martha twice went to camp. That's wrong. Martha went every winter. Now, that may not sound like much, but remember, this is in the middle of the winter in an open carriage, unpaved roads, through enemy lines. She wasn't a spring chicken, and no GPS. So this is happening. Moreover, what did Martha do when she was in winter camp? In fact, I have a book over there on George Washington. I brought a copy. Just came out this past year. Won the silver medal as the book of the year internationally. Stanford won the gold. So next year we're going to take him out. A book on George Washington, and in it, I even suggested that Martha helped win the Revolutionary War. How? When she would visit George Washington, it lifted Washington's spirits, his mood. You know, they're losing him. There's calls for him to be replaced. These 18-year-old boys who had never been away from home, they're hungry, they're afraid, they're shoeless. They miss their moms. They're in camp, and all of a sudden this Bubby shows up, and she's like making matzo ball soup for everybody. Okay, I fit there, but you get the point. She cooked for the army. She cooked for the army. Here's a soldier's hands to be kind. She read letters that were written to them by mothers, girlfriends, and wives. She helped them draft letters. She would knit scarves and socks for them in Valley Forge. Martha's there knitting, knitting, knitting. I mean, she was mothering the army. Hamilton, who was Washington's right-hand man, as the musical says, and he really was. Hamilton is a great source. There's some sources in history that if I read something from them, I don't question it. Ulysses Grant, Harry Truman, Alexander Hamilton. Some folks were just genetically incapable of lying. Donald Trump, just couldn't have a lie. I mean, Hamilton, all three of those guys, Grant, Hamilton, Truman, they get themselves in trouble by admitting things that they've done. I mean, they just couldn't. I love Truman's memoir, one of the best presidential memoirs, because he tells us about all the mistakes he made. Grant's memoir, I'd say those are the two best presidential memoirs, and a lot of historians agree. Grant, in his memoir, tells us that during the badass Ulysses Grant, U.S. unconditional surrender Grant, as they call it, he tells us he was afraid. I mean, that's fantastic, right? Anyways, so Hamilton's a reliable source. When Martha arrives in camp, Hamilton writes down the following line, quote unquote, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived in camp. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can finally get down to the business of winning the war," end quote. Because she lifted everybody up. We don't appreciate that. Martha left behind 157 letters, probably 10 times as many, but she might have burned them, or friends might have burned her letters out of respect for her interest in privacy. But of the letters that survive, history again does her a grave misjustice here, because there's only one quote, as far as I can tell, that makes some sense. Martha was asked once to describe herself. She said, quote unquote, "I'm an old-fashioned Virginia housekeeper, busy as a bee, steady as a clock, cheerful as a cricket." It's nice, that's cute, but it doesn't reveal the other side. We should publish some of the other letters in there, right? So Martha was quite. George called her his worthy partner. Washington goes to New York City, April 30th, 1789. It was the first inauguration, because DC was a swamp, still being built, right? George goes to NYC and then later Philadelphia to be sworn in. He had no idea what a president should do. Article 2 of the Constitution has 4 little sections. It doesn't say anything. It says, quote unquote, "A president shall have a State of the Union address from time to time," quote unquote. So George, through his every action and inaction, everything he said, didn't do, he was forging the office of presidency. But Martha created the office of First Lady and the whole art of social hosting and entertaining for the nation, this brand new nation. And she couldn't make it too regal because she would be aping the European monarchs. We were against it. She couldn't make it too common because we wouldn't have credibility. She found the 50-yard line and put together these wonderful hosted events for the country. She encouraged women to knit, sew, spin, and make their own clothing. That's sort of like Buy American, right? She got recipes from women around the country that serve American foods. So Martha was a great worthy partner, a great individual who's never really gotten the credit. And if George Washington is rightly, quote unquote, the father of his country, then Martha should declare the mantle of mother of her country. So Martha, always like Martha.
Yeah, how to hear.
Laura Secord, where are my Canadians? Any Canucks in here? Okay, then you guys, oh yeah, of course you do. Then you know all about this. And the next time you're up there, I will expect some Laura Secord chocolate and fudge. Otherwise, we are done. Our relationship is over. Okay? All right, so Laura Secord. This is an imagined young Laura Secord, and this is based on an image of her in reality later in life. So Laura Secord married a man. They were from Massachusetts, moved to Canada, had a tough life, a very tough life, struggling. Then the War of 1812 breaks out in the year 1812. And in 1813, the Americans decide to invade Canada. And the War of 1812 is not often discussed in textbooks. It's the unknown war, in part because it's an absolute embarrassment to the United States. We basically try 7 times to invade Canada, and a handful of Canadians, British, and Indians kick our butt every time. We try to commit genocide against the American Indians. We try to spread slavery. I mean, a bunch of Southerners had the most horrific objectives for the war. So we just don't put it in our textbooks, which would make our governor very happy. Anyway, so America tries to invade Canada in 1813, and they're hitting Canada around Niagara Falls, okay? The river that separates Ontario and Erie, the 2 lakes. And America's coming in at a place called Queenston Heights, okay? And at Queenston Heights, the British are actually holding us back, the British and Canadians with very few men. But then the great British general, Isaac Brock, who is like the Rock, and he's a great, great general, he gets shot and killed. And when he dies, the whole defense collapses and the Americans take it. They move into Canada, they commandeer Laura Secord's home as their headquarters. And she has a couple thousand troops bivouacked all around the area. All the officers are in her home. They tell her to cook for all the officers. Every bit of food they have saved up for the coming winter, every cow, everything is killed and eaten. So, I mean, they're going to struggle. Her husband was wounded at the battle. She has a husband dying in the bedroom. She has kids, and she's got to care for the American officers. So she works like a dog to cook for all the officers. Now, during this, the American officers are sitting around planning their invasion of Canada. So she gives them a lot of ale, a lot of heavy food, and when they all fall asleep, she walks all night long by herself through Mohawk Indian territory to find a couple British officers, a young lieutenant named Fitzgibbons. She finds a couple Mohawks, she finds a couple, I'm supposed to stand by the podium. Hey, just right here, boom. Yeah, okay, just pick me, all right. So I'll end up out there. I'll be in the pool. This is so difficult to stand still. Laura Secord walks all night long. I mean, hours and hours by herself through the forest, through hostile Mohawk Indian territory. Finds Fitzgibbons, finds a Mohawk chief, tells them where the Americans are, and tells them all the plans. The next day, when the Americans march, a small group of British and Indians set a trap and annihilate the American army, who retreats back across the border. She's the savior of Canada. And if you go to the Canadian capital, as I've done several times, there are statues of Isaac Brock and great Canadian heroes. One of the statues in front of the Capitol is her. So today there's stamps, there's stores, there's coffee, there's chocolate, there's cookies, ice cream. So the next time you're in Canada, you can skip bringing me the poutine or the beaver tail, but I will take some Laura Secord. So Laura Secord, another great hero, is a young woman. Brave. Mary Pickersgill. And I always thought she looked like she should be named Pickersgill. People look like the name, I suppose. So I'm so tall because Robert Watson. Very generic. Anyways, Mary Pickersgill also has a tough life. First husband dies. She's living in Philadelphia and Baltimore, back and forth. She has 4 children, 3 of them died. Daughter lives. She's very tough. She learns from her mother the art of being a seamstress, and she specializes in fancy embroidery on the sleeves of your jacket and so forth. She also learns to make flags, because the new country wants flags. And it was said nobody could make a five-cornered star, quite like Mary Pickersgill. So that she's eking out an existence with her daughter. The War of 1812, which began in the year and ended January 5th, January 8th, 1850. The War of 1812 strikes. She's now in Baltimore. And the British send a massive army under one of their best generals. His name is Robert Ross. And it's not just any army. These are veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. This is the army that beat Napoleon. So, and plus it was sort of like a 1814 version of Special Forces. So in the year 1814, the British finished with Napoleon. They sailed this massive army under Ross. They march on August 24th, 1814 into Washington. They rout us at Bladensburg, Maryland. In fact, we don't even call it the Battle of Bladensburg. We call it the Bladensburg Races, because the Americans ran like such cowards. Ross said the Americans ran like sheep before wolves. Anyway, so the British burned Washington to the ground. Now they're after their second main target, Baltimore. Baltimore, in some ways, even though Washington's the capital, is a much more important city. It's a lot larger. It's also a shipping center, right? An import-export center. And Fort McHenry is there. Anybody been to Inner Harbor? Right across the water, right? Fort McHenry has all of our artillery, powder, ordnance. You can fight a war based on all the ordnance in Fort McHenry. So if they can destroy Fort McHenry, we literally won't have the weaponry and ordnance to mount resistance. Here's the other problem. Fort McHenry is barely garrisoned. And it's commanded not by a general or colonel, a young major named Armistead. It's his first command. So they're in trouble. With word that the British are marching to Baltimore and Salem, they had an armada, a flotilla of warships sailing into what is now Inner Harbor and marching by land. The people of Baltimore were in a panic, and the word was to run away, flee, and abandon the city. So there's a full-scale panic in Baltimore. The mayor of the city and the governor of Maryland tell everybody to run. There's a crusty old Revolutionary War guy that looked like Ernest Borgnine. Okay? Again, you look like you are, who you are. His name was Smith, and he had a friend named Stricker. They were sort of like the two old guys from the Muppets, you know? So when they say that we're going to leave Baltimore and flee, these two say no. And they announce to the town, gather in the square, we're going to stay and we're going to fight. And we're in charge. Okay? We're going to stay and we're going to fight. What they do is they round up every boat in Baltimore and they sink them at the entrance to Inner Harbor. So now there's a gauntlet. The British cannot sail into Baltimore. They have to drop anchor, point some distance outside, and shell the city from afar, right? Got it? They also have a massive army led by Ross, the great Ross, marching into Baltimore. And Smith and Stricker say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to do the one thing the British will never expect. We're going to go on the offensive and attack them first. Now, they would never expect it. The British are marching into the city so confident. Remember, they just routed the Americans at Bladensburg. They burned the Capitol, and all we did was run. Okay? Incompetence, cowardice. The British are marching in. They don't even have people on the flanks or in advance. As they're marching into Baltimore, all of a sudden, out of the woods, musket fire, and farmers come running out with axes, pickets, fishing pole, stabbing and hacking into the British. The British weren't ready for it. Ross rides forward to the front of the line to encourage his men on and is shot and killed. With Ross dead, the British wilt and they abandoned the attack. But now that Baltimore folks, the residents still have the naval attack coming. So an armada of warships anchors outside of Baltimore. And Armistead is worried because everybody wants to flee. His men inside the fort want to flee, so he meets with Mary Pickersgill and says, I want you to make a flag, but not any flag. I want the largest flag ever made. Something like 40 feet by 30. Wow. Just massive flag. She goes to a warehouse. She and her daughter have a maid. They hire a former slave. They hire some other, and they toil and they produce in record time the biggest flag ever made. And they bring it to Fort McHenry, and Armistead flies it to try to inspire the people. Well, as the battle's ready to begin, there's word that Americans are inspired by. We know exactly where and when the British are coming because there's a Scottish doctor who flipped sides and supported us. His name was Dr. Beans. That's not Mr. Bean, but Dr. Beans. And when Dr. Beans was treating the British, he listened in and knew all their secrets, sort of like Laura Seacole, right? So the British realized this, so they arrest Dr. Beans and they take him aboard the flagship, the HMS Tonic, the flagship of the British Armada. And they try him and find him guilty. Once they finish bombing Baltimore back to the Stone Ages and invading, then they're going to hang him. The problem was Dr. Beans rendered us a great service. So people rally and they try to find a lawyer to go out and negotiate for his release. And they find this very handsome, he was Brad Pitt of the day, lawyer and poet named Francis Scott Key. And he goes on board the ship to negotiate Dr. Beans' release. He's smart. What he does is he gets British soldiers who Dr. Beans saved their lives, to write testimony. And he lays them all out on the table and says, you're going to put this man to death. So they agree to pardon him. But they say he knows all the secrets. Key and Beans have to stay on board the flagship all night long while the British bomb Baltimore and Fort McHenry back to the Stone Ages. So Key paces the deck with Dr. Beans watching the rockets red glare, watching the bombs bursting in air. And his only hope that in the morning got our flag. And it was. And it was a big flag, the flag that Mary Pickersgill sewed in record time. And they raised that flag, Armistead did, and Fort McHenry, against all odds, stayed, survived. And the soldiers didn't flee, and the people in the town didn't flee, and a part of it was seeing this magnificent flag that Mary Pickersgill. Stars and Stripes, Old Glory, she's now in the American Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian, right, everyone? Everybody, how many people have been there to see it? The Museum of American History, yeah. I used to teach at Georgetown. Both my kids are in college in DC. I go all the time for my research. Every time I go see the flag. I also go to the Lincoln Memorial and talk to Abe. So Mary Pickersgill, Sojourner Truth. Her name was Isabel Bumfree, B-A-U-M. She was raised in New York with a Dutch slave-owning family. Had to have one of the worst lives ever. She was repeatedly beaten and raped by her slave owner, bore him a few children, and then after that, he sold her to another slave owner and she would never see the kids again. The second slave owner beat her repeatedly and raped her and she bore him several children, and then he sold her to a third one who beat her regularly and raped her and she had children with him. The third one was the worst because the slave owner's wife was angry and jealous that the slave owner kept visiting Sojourner Truth out in Isabel Bumfree out in the slave quarters. In the 17 and 1800s, the word that Southern, and I'm going to put it in finger quotes, gentlemen, Southerners used, they called it night walking. We would say rape. They would say the Southern gentleman would say, I'm going out for a walk. And of course, women had no rights, slaves had no rights, a slave woman has zero rights. So a horrific life, repeatedly beaten, repeatedly raped, lots of kids, she never sees them again. Finally, she has enough. She meets a slave man, and their name is Robert, and they fall in love, and she wants to marry Robert. The slave owner's wife, to get her back, orders Robert whipped and beaten. They beat him to death in front of her. After that, she gets her youngest daughter and runs. She escapes. She escapes. She says, I'm no longer Isabella Bumfree. I'm now Sojourner Truth. And she goes back into the South and finds one son in Alabama and brings him back. So she gets 2 kids out of 11 back. She becomes a great orator and rhetorician. You've all heard of Frederick Douglass, the great slave orator, who was sort of a proto-Martin Luther King, just a remarkable orator. Think of King's oration and his rhetoric, right? Stirring, to say the least. I mean, chills and tears. Frederick Douglass was not only a great orator like King, but he had a stern face that looked like it was etched in stone, right? And Douglass was very dramatic, very theatrical. when he would be on stage, of course, back then you didn't have electricity and money, he would hold a lamp, candle lamp, and he would pretend to be a slave escaping on the Mississippi. He would say things like, yea, even on Mark Twain's beloved Mississippi, I hear the crack of a whip and the shackle of a chain. Shh. As he was escaping. I mean, imagine the theatrics only with him doing it, right? It's James Earl Jones' voice, Martin Luther King oratory. And at the end, he would say, you know, our movement, anti-slavery, abolition, has grown too strong to be snuffed out. And he'd put the candle out like a lantern, and the stage would be dark. So they lit the lanterns, he was off the stage. And so that's drama. Great speaker. They said Sojourner Truth was the female equivalent to him. She travels the North speaking, arguably, probably the first Black woman that most white Northerners ever heard speak. And she's powerful and passionate. And she speaks with a heavy Dutch accent. So it wasn't the Southern slave vernacular colloquialism that people expected. It was with a Dutch accent. Her most famous speech was called Ain't I a Woman? I encourage you to read it sometime. It's great. She uses metaphor and keeps going back, sort of like Martin Luther King's, blah, 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 from the great Amber Razor Brain, I have a dream. From Allegheny Mountains, well, I have a dream. To this, I have a dream. Only she keeps coming back to Ain't I a Woman. She'll say something like, men say women are too weak to have rights. These hips have borne 11 children. Ain't I a woman? Men say women can't do A, B, and C. These hands, these calloused hands that pick tons of cotton alongside men, ain't I a woman? They say women, I have laid there and kept quiet while being repeatedly raped by slave owners. Ain't I a woman? At the point. So she gave the speech and she became an advocate for not only women's rights, but abolition. So she was one of the most prominent speakers of her time. Sojourner Truth gave money that she made for speeches to help escape slaves, to help women whose husbands had died, became a real philanthropist in addition to everything else she did. Sojourner. Elizabeth Van Loo. They called her Crazy Bet. I love Crazy Bet. So Elizabeth Van Loo, she's from Richmond. That's her mansion in Richmond. Her father was a Quaker from Philadelphia, which means he was an abolitionist. Philadelphia was the hotbed of progressivism and abolition for much of our history. He moves to Richmond, becomes the wealthiest resident of Richmond, and dies and leaves everything to her. He doesn't have any sons. She's the wealthiest person in Richmond. She never marries. She's the old spinster. They call her Crazy Bet because she had just strange ideas. She didn't believe in marriage. She believed in women's rights, and she believed in abolition. So she was kind of a gadfly in Richmond. What she did with her fortune, she bought slaves freedom, and they lived with her civilly. She treated them well, paid them, and many of them didn't want to leave because where are you going to go, right? So she's living during the Civil War, 1861 to 65. Richmond, of course, is the capital of the Confederacy. The first capital was Montgomery in Alabama, but they realized it was too remote and too backwater. They moved it to Richmond, which had 5 railways, the James River, multiple roads. Made much more sense. So she's in Richmond. Jefferson Davis is in Richmond. Robert E. Lee's in Richmond, the whole command. And throughout the Civil War, the Confederate command was just going bonkers because they had evidence that there was a high-profile, high-placed Union spy in Richmond who infiltrated Jefferson Davis's Confederate White House, infiltrated Lee's command, and they couldn't find out who the spy was the entirety of the war. Guess who the spy was? It was Crazy Bet. She played crazy because no one would think an older woman would be a spy. And of course, the genteel South would never expect a woman. I wrote a book called Escape. It's about the biggest prison break in history. It came out last year. Good news, this winter, the History Channel is going to make it into a film, and Morgan Freeman's going to narrate it. So I'm super duper excited. Just signed the contract. So anyway, it's about the biggest prison break in history, which was from an absolutely wretched Confederate prison called Libby, inside Richmond. And the Confederates just slaughtered Union soldiers. You've heard of Andersonville, you've heard of Belle Isle. Southerners died in Union prisons if a disease broke out. But Northerners died in Southern prisons by barbarity, murder, torture, neglect. In the South, something wrong. So, Crazy Bet is deep undercover, spying Richmond. She visits the Libby prison, which houses generals, colonels, and majors. And what she does is she brings food. She has so much money and a network of spies and union that even though Richmond's in a starvation atmosphere by early '63, quite frankly, she has enough connections. She bakes all this food, and she and the former slaves she freed, they bring it to the prison. They tell the guards who are starving, we'll give you fresh bread, this, that, and the other thing, if you allow us to give some to the prisoners. So the guards say, of course, because they're starving. She keeps these prisoners alive. But what she does is she hollows out eggs and puts secret notes in. She gets a codex. General Grant and General Benjamin Butler teach her how to use a codex, a spy machine. She writes in lemon juice and heat it up with milk, and letters appear. She has all these, she helps the Union soldiers to escape. She's running this spy ring the whole time. Unfortunately, when the war ended, she was discovered. And local citizens surrounded her house like in a Dracula movie with torches, threatening to burn the house down with her and the former slaves in it. She goes out on the porch and screams at all of them, saying, you do know I'm friends with Grant. And if anybody lays a finger on me or this house, Grant's on his way. And she talked them out. She talked them out. Now, they did steal all of her money and everything she had, so she was destitute. But all those Union soldiers, including the grandson of Paul Revere, that she helped to escape, sent her money. Ulysses Grant became president and gave her a postmaster general. So she had a job. So Crazy Bet was remarkable, saved countless Union lives, risked her life repeatedly, and who knew, right? Elizabeth Van Leeuwen. Victoria Woodhull. Victoria Woodhull was amazing. Young, attractive, self-taught lawyer, first woman to open up a financial house on Wall Street, published her own book. She also became the first woman ever to run for president. 1872, Victoria Woodhull. Long before Margaret Chase Smith or Shirley Chisholm or Hillary or others, she ran in 1872. She was a social reformer who advocated what she called free love. Her argument was this: women cannot say no. Even like today, we say, don't be a bystander, be an upstander. Every kid hears it at school, we teach it at Lynn, orientation, we harp on the students, always be an upstander. No means no means no means no means no. But she said women literally can't say no. And if not, her husband will rape her and beat her, and there's no court in the land. She also said it's a double whammy. Women are not supposed to enjoy it either. Men can enjoy it, misbehave, but if a woman does that, she's scarlet on her and burned at the stake. So she was advocating free love, which would have to wait 100 years until the 1960s and 70s. She gets so frustrated with the constant harassment by Southerners, conservatives, and preachers that she says, I'm running for president. Now, when she announced she was running, she was arrested. She tried to register to vote, she was arrested. And on election day, she tried to cast a vote for herself and she was arrested. Women would not get the right to vote until 1920, right? With the 19th Amendment. Still, she was a mover and shaker, well ahead of her time, despite constant threats, constant death threats from preachers. I always thought that was interesting. Conservatives and Southerners, she was undeterred. Carrie Chapman Catt. One of my friends asked if I'm talking about Lucy Stone today. She didn't make my cut. But, Lucy Stone fans and your daughter would be pleased to know I'm going to talk about Triple C. Carrie Chapman Catt, another one of my gals. So probably no one did more to get women the right to vote than her. Now, the women's suffrage movement begins in the 1840s with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Prussian mob. Probably heard those names. What happens is after the Civil War, the movement splits into two. There's an American women's suffrage movement and a national women's suffrage movement. Lucy Stone leads one, which is progressive and younger, favors women's, what we would call family planning. Susan B. Anthony is a conservative and opposes family planning and basic women's rights. That's why we celebrate Susan B. Anthony and made a point after her. Lucy Stone gets no love because she believed in family planning. Anyways, the problem was the movement split, a huge irreparable rift, to the point where they're fighting one another instead of keeping their eye on the prize of getting women's rights. So enter Carrie Chapman Catt. She brings both groups together, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, and creates the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she finds the 50-yard line on issues and reminds them, if we don't agree on things like family planning, abortion, and the vote, we can all agree on other things, like women ought to be able to divorce, which they couldn't, ought to be able to own land, which they couldn't, ought to be able to appear in court, which they couldn't, ought to be able to speak in court, which they couldn't, ought to be able to inherit, which they couldn't. That went to the oldest son or brother. So she really brought everybody together. The second thing she does, which I think was simple, brilliant but simple. Sometimes the most brilliant, effective things are the most simple and obvious. What she says is, it's difficult to get a constitutional amendment. We've only amended our Constitution 27 times, everybody. Don't forget, 10 of them were the Bill of Rights straight away. And one of them was after we had prohibition, we overturned prohibition. So throw those two out. We've only had a few amendments. It's hard to amend. You have to get 2/3 of the House and Senate, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify. So what she says is, this is impossible. Why don't we instead change our focus? And why don't we just get one state to give women the right to vote? If it works, we'll now have a template, a model on how to do it. Secondly, the usual suspects, conservatives, preachers, and Southerners, are claiming that women will no longer give birth, the human race will end. I think it's called fear mongering and scare tactics. Not that we know anything about that. So she says, if we get the right to vote for women in one state, we can prove that everything's fine. It's brilliant. So they all agree and say, yeah. Now, the obvious thing, you're going to think, where do we get women the right to vote? New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey. Nope, out west. Let's go to Colorado, the territory of Wyoming. Let's go to Utah. And she said, that's where we're, and they thought she was mad. But she said, we have a secret weapon. There are no women out there. Therefore, the men are really desperate. So she goes out and she says, here's the deal. All those Western states, like from a Clint Eastwood movie set, she says, if you grant women the right to vote, I will bring hundreds of women out in the spring. And she ultimately, and they're like, yes, where do we sign? She goes, oh, before you sign, we also need the right to appear in a court of law, to speak in law, to inherit, to own property, to divorce, to get a business license, to go to college. Oh, wait, I'm not done yet. The men are like, where do we sign? Made a big list, and they signed, and those states joined and gave women the right to vote. So ironically, some of the first states were out there. Now see the model, now see the template. And years later, in 1920, when the vote came up, those states voted to give women the right to vote. Of course, the West Coast and the East did. Of course, the South and Midwest did not. But they had enough states cobbled together to get it passed. So a brilliant move on her part to bring everything together. The other thing she did was she trained attractive young women in the art of public speaking. And she informed and educated them about the issues of the day. Because men believe that, you know, the tenderness of women is not so suited to politics. So all of a sudden they see a beautiful young girl get up there, she has their attention. And she's educated, articulate, on top of the issues. And that all begins to change perspective. So Carrie Chapman Catt. Edith Bowling Gall. So that's Woodrow Wilson, who was president from 1913 to 1921, a Democrat, who was the governor of New Jersey and president of Princeton, was from Virginia. Wilson's first wife, Ellen Axon, died in the White House. And Wilson was grief-stricken. One, he was having affairs, including with a woman named Mrs. Peck. They used to call Wilson Mrs. Peck's bad boy. He would go to her resort in Bermuda. One, he was having affairs, so I felt guilty. But two, Wilson, well, to his credit, he surrounded himself with impressive women. His mother, his sister, his 3 daughters, his wife, a lot of very, very sharp, impressive women. And without his wife around, he was utterly lost. So Wilson starts courting pretty quickly. I'm not talking Boca Brisket Brigade quick. Quick nonetheless, okay? And that's a New York minute. So, and he starts courting this one, Edith Bowling Gall. Women did not pose for, for images like that, did they? Look at the confidence, sassiness. This is in the 19 teens, everybody. So, who was Edith? She was a widow. Her husband, Galt, was a wealthy jeweler who died and left her everything. She had been sent away to boarding school because she was so sassy and loose. She was kicked out of 2 boarding schools. She was a piece of work. Anyways, in Washington, D.C., there were, I've read them in preparation for one of my books, actually 2 books. She was the subject of the social gossip pages. She was a scandal. Today she'd be a Kardashian, except she was smart and had some skills. Would you like to hear the 2 big scandals that all the papers talked about? Yes. Would you like to hear it? Tammy, is that okay, even though this is Gleneagles? Well, you're married now, so number 1, here's the big scandal that hit the Washington papers. She drove her own car. I know, right? Kim Kardashian, who? Secondly, she used to go to parties on escort, and she danced with whoever the hell she wanted to. So at one of those events, she meets straight-laced, puritanical Tommy, as she called it, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And let's just say, because it is Gleneagles, that she rocked his world, if you know what I mean. So the Washington press corps and politicians, they would keep an eye on the White House to see when Edith would enter and leave at all hours of the day and night. In fact, the joke in Washington at the time was that when World War I started, Edith was so shocked that she fell out of the president's bed. Her scandal became legendary due to one of the best, if not the best, typo in the history of Washington newspapering. The paper, and all the quotes, by the way, are verbatim. I work hard to memorize all the quotes and dates and details. But the quote in the paper is supposed to say, the president was again seen entertaining the widow Gall in public. It was a typo. The president was again seen entering the widow Gall. So it's just perfect. So she becomes first lady. During World War I, she's helping him to encrypt, decode World War I national security secrets, not at Mar-a-Lago, in the White House. Remarkable. Wilson has a stroke, massive stroke, Colonel Stocks. At the end of the war, as you all remember from school when we used to teach history, and we actually taught civics. Now we do standardized testing in Florida, and it works really well. At the end of the war, Wilson was the architect of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. But in order to get a treaty ratified, you need the Senate. So Wilson goes back, and I know this is a shocker. The Republicans refuse to ratify anything, even though it hurt the country. I know that's a shocker, but work with me. So Wilson decides he's going to go on a nationwide speaking tour to rally the people to put pressure on their elected senators. He's weak, he has a massive stroke and almost dies. He's bedridden for months, doesn't meet with Congress, doesn't meet with the cabinet, doesn't meet with the press. Who meets with Congress, the cabinet, and the press? Edith. Here's the pickle. It was 1 year before women got the right to vote. So we basically had Madam Presidentialist, or at the least a regent, right? So Edith did quite a bit. Trudy, Gertrude Elion, where's my lawyer friend? There we are. So who met her? Took her deposition. What, 1971? Around there. Okay, when you were like 4. Okay. Send me a cookie. So Gertrude Elion's family, Jewish family, escaped pogroms and persecution in Europe. She is a gifted scientist. Her specialty is chemistry. Of course, women aren't supposed to be good in science and chemistry, so she's kind of an outlier. She has trouble getting into college. She wants to go to grad school. She can't get into grad school. She's working at a school teaching odds and ends jobs. Her father won't pay for school. No one would admit her. She makes enough money. She gets through NYU in chemistry. PhD programs won't accept her, no one will accept her. Long story short, she goes to work for a little old startup called Johnson & Johnson. And she works with two famous men there who are leading scientists. And together they work on a whole array of new medicines, cures, and treatments for leukemia, for gout, for malaria, and for herpes. And they're successful. Those two scientists leave, you see a picture there, and they go down to Chapel Hill for a new startup, research triangle. And they take Gertrude with them, Trudy with them. And they continue to just mass produce medicines, cures. She publishes something on the order of 250 academic articles. I've published 200, and the people on the campus can't believe I did that many. And I have a computer and a cushy academic job. She did more as a woman developing all these. At any rate, after the two men passed away, as people were going through the papers, they realized, guess who it was that was coming up with all the science? And it was Trudy, Gertrude. 1988, she's finally recognized, wins the Nobel Prize for chemistry. So one of the great female scientists, well, let me rephrase it, one of the great scientists, period, of all time. Sacagawea. Getting there. I know you're starting to salivate looking at the cookies. So you're looking at Lewis and Clark. Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's secretary, and a lot like Jefferson. He was a poet, he was an architect, he was a Renaissance man, knew Latin, Greek. So he's very worldly, a Renaissance man. Clark was the big badass. Clark could fight Indians, he spoke native dialects. Clark could navigate by the stars, he could hunt, he could fight. Clark's the guy that in the middle of the woods, he could pick up a leaf, smell it, and say there were 12 deer here yesterday at 1 o'clock headed northeast. That's Clark, okay? So Jefferson puts together this brilliant team, and their core of discovery is what they called the few dozen men that went all the way across the country. Let us remember that in the 1800s, this is the equivalent of the moonshot. There was a saying at the time that a squirrel on the East Coast could run to the Pacific. Nobody knew how far it was. Nobody had any idea. 2 days, 20 days, 1,000 days. A squirrel could run to the Pacific and never touch the ground because they thought it was a never-ending forest. They had no idea about the Midwest or the Rockies. No idea. They met with a famous professor in Philadelphia who told them they're liable to encounter woolly mammoths and dinosaurs. Yeah, so that's why they call Clark. They set off, and amazingly, all the way across the country and all the way back, they lose only one man, a sergeant named Floyd. And he died because he had his appendix burst. And so something relatively simple, but out in the middle of nowhere. So they do a remarkable job. The problem is the first winter they get to the man-day camp. They're out in the territory of what is today like Montana and so on. And it's bitter cold, feet of snow, they're frozen, they're out, supplies out of everything. The man bands are friendly and let them stay there. And there's a young teenage girl that was a slave, Sacagawea. She was Shoshone. Talk about a tough upbringing. She was stolen and sold to another tribe, who was then sold to another tribe, who was then sold to another tribe, ad nauseum. So she was a slave. The thing is, though, she traveled all across the West and knew a lot of Indian dialects from constantly being a slave. We're not sure how old she is. This is an estimate. So she would have been a young teenager at the time. She was ultimately, by the Mandans, sold to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French trapper, who was a drunk and repeatedly beat her and raped her. In the camp, she's pregnant. She delivers during that winter in the Mandan camp. She catches the eye of Clark, not in a sexual way, in like a daughter way. Clark realizes how smart and intelligent she is. They know dialects, and Clark knows they need a guide. So the Mandans say, take Toussaint Charbonneau. And Clark says, God, no, the guy's a drunk and a charlatan. And that winter, after she gives birth, Charbonneau tries to rape her, and Clark beats the living you-know-what out of Charbonneau. To the point where Charbonneau never bothers her again because Clark was the rock. So Clark hires her, and this young teenage girl with a baby leads this group across the Rocky Mountains. Extraordinary. And she made it, and they made it. At one point, they're ready to eat the horses they have because they're so skinny and they can't use them. They're running behind schedule. The winter's coming in the next year. They run into a Shoshone warrior, and she starts talking to the Shoshone warrior who remembers her as a girl. Her brother's now the chief of the Shoshone. So he trades and gives them horses to make it across them. So she is invaluable. She makes it all the way back. And after she makes it all the way back, Clark invites her and her little boy, who he calls Pumpy, invites her and the boy to come live with him in Missouri. He's now the governor of Missouri. He's going to take care of them. And she dies after all that. So Clark adopts the boy, treats him to a fine education. The boy lives a long, prosperous life under Clark's guidance. But Sacagawea helped one of the greatest American expeditions of discovery in history as a little girl pregnant. All right, I'm going to start to go quickly because it's like 9 a.m. on Thursday already. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So Lucy Stone, here we go. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the mother of the women's movement. Love Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So in 1840, she gets married. And there were honeymoons back then if you were wealthy. So her husband says, let's go on a honeymoon. Where do you want to go? She says, well, there's an anti-slavery convention in England. That's what I'd like to do for my honeymoon. That is so my kind of gal, right? So they get on a wooden ship and sail across the ocean. And she goes to the anti-slavery convention, and guess what? Women are not allowed in. I mean, something fundamentally wrong. So she's outside, livid, and she meets Lucretia Mott. She was from New York. Mott was from Massachusetts, a Quaker. They were both abolitionists, both well-read, both supported women's rights. And the two of them are sitting there stewing. They say, when we get back to the U.S., we're going to create a women's movement, get the right to vote. A very young Black man was in attendance and was just the hero and the highlight of the whole convention from his oratory. He comes outside and sees them and sits down, and he tries to get them in, but they won't let him. So he says, then I'm not going back in, I'm joining you two. His name is Frederick Douglass, who becomes best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1848, they made it happen, the Seneca Falls Convention. 2 days in July at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. They bring over 300 people, including men, and they did let them in. And they work on a series of what they call the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence. Why Declaration of Sentiments? Snarky. Here's why, because men said women are too sentimental to have the right. So she owned it and called it the Declaration of Sentiments. Things like women should be able to divorce, own land, inherit property, appear in court, and blah, 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 blah. The 11th one out of 11, vote. And on the second day, they ratify these, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton really is a mover and shaker. 100 other things, but I'm way behind time, so I'm going to shock myself and skip all that good stuff. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, about 4'11", probably didn't weigh a buck. Okay? Harriet Tubman used to have vivid dreams, and God came to her and told her she's Moses. And he wants her to let my people go, to not suffer the bonds of slavery, go confront Pharaoh. Okay? Why did she have these wild dreams? And she would have epileptic seizures, where she would fall on the ground, and she was hit in the head. We don't know the details, either a rock or a brick, either thrown or hammered by a slave owner in her head. We believe she fractured her skull, had swelling, so she these vivid, out-of-the-body dreams. She finally has enough of everything, so she runs away with her two brothers. They get scared, and they go back. She's furious with them. Remember, if a runaway slave is caught, a foot's cut off, you're tortured, you could be killed, you could be filleted, right? To set an example. So her brothers get afraid and run back. She runs away, and she had told her husband, she was married, that she will be back for him. Shortly after, she goes back, and he already remarried. So she leaves his butt there, and then she decides she's going to get slaves out, so she becomes one of the chief conductors of the Underground Railroad, which you know all about. She leads multiple efforts in the Underground Railroad. It's believed that she never lost a passenger. There was no railroad, it was a metaphor. She was the conductor, the passengers were the slaves. The train station was a safe house, etc. So people would put candles in the windows in a certain way, and she knew that they were safe houses. They would run by night and hide by day. And on all these trips, she would start all of them by giving the same speech to all these, she'd take groups of 8, 10, 12, and she carried a gun. She'd open up her cloak and show a pistol. And she said, this pistol is not for all the slave owners that are going to hunt us down. It's not for the bounty hunters that would kill you to make money. It's not for the dogs. This pistol's for you. If you question me, if you don't keep up, if you make a noise, I'll kill you. Are we clear? She's about this big. I've always said, Harriet Tubman versus The Rock. Oh, my money's in Harriet Tubman. I give The Rock a minute, he's out of the ring. So she was badass, and after delivering folks to freedom, Eastern Pennsylvania, Southern New York, Eastern Ohio, she would go back and get another group, and then go back and get another by herself. And there were wanted posters everywhere for her. And I put this up because she always wore a do-rag, so she was representing. After the war, when the war started, she served as a guide and spy for the Union because she knew the land. She then, late in life, opens up an old woman's home for destitute women and used her fame and speaking fees to fund it. So Harriet Tubman, probably 4'11", not even a buck. She needed some Gleneagles cookies, that's for sure. Jane Addams, you've all heard of the Hull House, HULL, first American woman to win the Nobel Prize. I'm going to just skip through this. Of course, if a daughter was pregnant, if a woman was pregnant outside of marriage, that was it, right? Women would beat if a woman was. So any woman who was pregnant, thrown out of the house, she would bring them to the Hull House. She set up schools for the kids. She taught them go technical type of jobs. They had health care. She taught them to cook. They had kitchens. It was like a women's center. And from Chicago, they branch out. She wins the Nobel Prize. One of her big supporters and fundraisers was Eleanor Roosevelt. So she was amazing. Two more. Rachel Carson, sort of like Trudy Elliott, Gertrude Elliott. Rachel Carson, also a female scientist, had trouble getting into school. No graduate school would accept her. No PhD program. So she went to work for the National Park Service. And she became a marine biologist, where she writes influential articles about water pollution. And ultimately, that would influence Lyndon Johnson in the 60s to the Clean Water Act, which was gutted under the previous president, but it's now reinforced again. So we all need water. So she was a big advocate for clean water. So she also was doing some studies on her own about the effects of DDT, Agent Orange, pesticides, herbicides, rodenticides, insecticides, fungicides. We were mass producing all these chemicals, and they weren't tested. A lot of them were carcinogens. So not only are they bad for people, but they had impacts in the web of life in the ecosystem. For example, birds that ingested insects or fish that were filled with all these chemicals, their eggs were not hardening. Birds are short-lived. So if they have a nesting season where the rookery doesn't have its successful hatchings, they're in imminent danger of extinction, right? So she warned us that all these chemicals, and she called for the regulation of the big businesses and chemical industry, which earned her the wrath. I know you're going to be surprised. Preachers, conservatives, and certain parties. I just lambasted. Male scientists hammered her, said she's out of her field, she's not credible. She worked on it. She wrote Silent Spring, right? Which is basically the Bible, the manifesto of the environmental movement. Kicked off the whole environmental movement in the 60s, and of course, our first Earth Day in April of 1970. Her book identified and discussed 4 types of birds that were going extinct. The California condor, the greatest, largest bird, right? The peregrine falcon, the fastest. The pelican, which I think is just adorable. And the bald eagle. And in a way, thank God it was the bald eagle, because Americans could give up what about a pelican or a crow. But if a bald eagle was just, it caught our attention. And her title was remarkable, and she got hammered for this. Today, we finally appreciate Silent Spring. What she said was, nature does not need to have human utility. We don't save a certain animal because it eats mice and that'll protect our crops. We don't save a certain seed because much of the world eats rice or whatever. It doesn't have to have human utility. It should be able to exist just because. And she said, and probably the biggest impact of losing birds will be on the human soul. In the spring, not hearing the birds sing. What is a silent spring to the human condition? And of course, she was hammered for that, which I absolutely applaud. Several years ago, I testified about saving the manatees, and I used the whole work. I was quoting it, but nobody knew because nobody knew all that. And I was showing how the manatee doesn't really, we don't use them for meat. They don't eat sharks. They don't really serve a niche. They're just these cute things. But the manatee still has a right to exist. And you know why? Because. Just because. Didn't work. Anyway, so Rachel Carson, sadly, she died right when she was becoming famous. So she didn't live to see the fruits. Last one, Charlotte Sorkine. She marries a psychologist named Noschwitz. She was the Harriet Tubman of the Holocaust. So first off, the young Charlotte looked like Raquel Welch. Now, did anybody ever see the great D-Day movie, The Longest Day? If you cruise with me and we go to Normandy, I always show the movie before. Great cast, right? Henry Fonda and Sean Connery, John Wayne. Remember Red Buttons? He played John Steele, the paratrooper who got stuck in St. Mary Place, right? That really happened. And if you go there today, they have a parachute and a dummy. And I thought they should have the dummy look like Red Buttons. But at any rate, the opening scene of that movie, I love. And it's based on a true story. I love it for a couple of reasons. When I was a kid, this was my girl. I thought she was just, I watched that movie so many times. So it's based on a true story. In the real world, that beautiful actress you haven't seen was Charlotte. At age 17, she joined the French Resistance. And I should say a lot of the foot soldiers in the French Resistance were Jews and women, and therefore Jewish women, including her. Frances Bloch Sarazen was the main bomb maker for the French Resistance, a young Jewish woman who was beheaded in public by the Nazis, 42, I think it was. Anyway, so the opening scene is based on a true story, and it was the story of Charlotte. So there's some Jewish and French resistance fighters, there's a wagon with hay, and underneath the hay are the guns. And they're ready to get them, and all of a sudden a bunch of two-stepping Nazis come marching around the corner. And these guys are sons, so they dive under the wagon. She comes riding by, and she hitches her skirt way up, and she wrecks on her bike and pulls the skirt up to show everything. The Nazis run over and are flying with her. She flirts with them long enough so that the folks get away. She risked her life. It's just remarkable. I apologize for another crazy reference, but Inglourious Bastards, Quentin Tarantino. You know the scene where all the Nazis go in the theater and he locks the doors and blows it up? She did that on the French Riviera coast. She took a train with a suitcase of explosives through a theater the Nazis went to. She was so attractive and so good at it that she got the Nazi officers on the train with her to carry the suitcase off. So they never inspected it. She was hitching up her skirt and she looked like Raquel Welch or something. So at any rate, she forges identities. Her mother died. She forged her father's identity and helped him to escape. He was a famous professor. She forges identities of Jewish children, typically orphans, and she takes them to Switzerland or to Lisbon, and she helps them to escape. And after taking children across countries for days, hiding, going at night, she would go back by herself and do more. She was a Harriet Tubman in the Holocaust. How did she get resistance fighters in Switzerland and captains of ships in Lisbon to take these kids to safety? Look at her. She actually survived the war. She becomes a psychologist, goes to an academic conference in New York, meets Professor Noschwitz. They get married, they live a long life, have kids, live in New York. I tried to interview her several times, but she just never talked about her story. So another great hero. We're still having heroes from the Holocaust that we don't know about. So these are some of my favorite heroes from history. Thank you. Great one. So let me take a couple of quick questions, and then we'll eat cookies. Yes, ma'am. Hedy Lamarr. Okay, yeah, a skilled scientist, wrote academic articles, involved in espionage. Hedy Lamarr did not make my list, however. That doesn't mean, who am I? I cut out Abigail Adams. Eleanor Roosevelt, I cut her out. I figured you all know all about her. Have fun in Philadelphia at the 3-year-old's birthday, right? Okay, good.
With Mary Washington, did she actually marry that 37-year-old?
Yeah, so young Martha, who was nicknamed Mary or Polly, she married the 37-year-old when she was 17. They had 4 children. He was the heir to the wealthiest tobacco fortune. 2 of her 4 children died, and then her husband died, her husband's father died, and her father died, leaving her as a 26-year-old widow with the largest tobacco empire in Virginia, and 2 little children. So people married quickly then, but she's basically running this, which is equivalent of a big corporation today, while raising these 2 young children. That's when George shows up. And George courted her with lightning speed. They met at, they both spent time in Williamsburg. They may have met one another earlier in their life, may have. She was at a higher rung than him, of course. But his father was middle upper class. His father died when George was a little boy. So he was a boy. He was that status. Then he was downgraded. He and his mother, Mary Ball, lived on a little farm on the Rappahannock, and he was milking cows with pants with holes in it. So what happened was she marries, and everybody dies, and she's running this plantation by herself. And that's when George shows up. They met at a neighbor's house named Chamberlain, and George was racing to Williamsburg to meet with the colonial governor, whose name was Robert Dinwiddie. Anybody been to the governor's residence in Williamsburg? Still there, it's beautiful, right? Okay. So George is 25, she's a year older. He's excited to go there. He stops to water his horse at Chamberlain's, and Chamberlain says, "Join me for dinner." George says, "No, I need to get to Williamsburg tonight. I want to be there early for my meeting tomorrow." Chamberlain says, "Well, that's a shame, because joining me for dinner tonight is the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia." George changes his mind. And just a few days later, literally a handful of days later, he visits her at one of her 4 mansions. It was called the 6-Chimney Home. It subsequently burned down, but you can imagine the size just based on the name. And he writes a letter to her London merchant named Robert Carey, C-A-R-Y. And in the letter, George requests an engagement ring and a slim nightie for Martha to wear for the honeymoon. So George moved on that. So she was a wealthy widow with 2 little children, who then those 2 kids died. Patsy at 17 of an epileptic seizure, and his son in his early 20s, he caught a camp fever at Yorktown in October of 1781.
I also have 5 silver dollars with Sacagawea's
Okay.
picture.
Yeah. So 200 years ago, they put Martha Washington on the dollar. We have Sacagawea dollars. Yeah, I got them for both my kids. Yeah. It was an excuse. They thought it was cool, but they had to listen to my Sacagawea stories. And then I gave them a couple. So, and bribe your kids. Yeah, good. One more. Everybody good? Well, there's books over there. I heard they're pretty good. 2 of them won National Book Awards. I'll hang out if you want to talk. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tammy Klein. Fox.